Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what is honestly one of the most fascinating paradoxes in human history, the French expedition in Egypt. It's a perfect example of how even the most meticulously planned events can go wildly, wonderfully off script. We're talking about the famous 1798 French campaign. It's an incredible story, really, of how a colossal military disaster inadvertently sparked a massive modern cultural and scientific renaissance. When we look at history, we usually just assume that the successful conquests leave the biggest legacies. But that brings us to the central question we're exploring today. How does a totally failed invasion end up changing the course of history? To unpack this, here is our agenda. We are going to cover a failed colonial ambition, the Great Cultural Clash, the Scientific Institute, unlocking ancient secrets, the Rosetta Stone, and finally, the lasting legacy. Let's jump right into Section 1, a failed colonial ambition, the doomed military campaign. So the French government wanted to create this sprawling new empire in the East, basically to strike a blow against their great rivals, the British. And Napoleon Bonaparte was the guy who led this massive military undertaking. But, well, Napoleon, along with his successors General Kleber and General Menou, ended up struggling against just absolutely impossible odds. What was supposed to be this glorious foundation for a new empire of the sword very quickly turned into a strategic nightmare. Literally almost nothing went right for them. First off, their fleet was completely obliterated by the British, which effectively trapped the entire French army in Egypt. Then you had these devastating outbreaks of the bubonic plague just decimating their ranks. And to top it all off, instead of being welcomed as modernizers like they hoped, they faced daily hostilities, intense local resistance, and massive bloody revolts in Cairo. It was just a complete logistical and political failure that ultimately got them expelled in 1801. Moving on to Section 2, the Great Cultural Clash. Two worlds collide. Because, as you'll see, moving beyond the actual battlefield, there was this profound cultural friction. The French basically brought their entire way of life with them. They expected to just recreate a miniature Paris right in the Middle East. We're talking the secular, highly public French revolutionary lifestyle, theaters, public drinking, and the free mingling of men and women. And of course, they clashed immediately with 18th century Egyptian society. The local culture was deeply conservative, firmly rooted in traditional Islamic values, and maintained strict gender separation. The colonizers made virtually no attempt to adapt, which completely alienated the local populace. In fact, the words of the Egyptian historian Al-Jabarti really vividly capture how the locals reacted to these new customs in Cairo. He wrote, "They created a building for entertainment and debauchery where men and women gathered, racing, dancing, and showing utmost debauchery." To the locals, this wasn't progress at all. It was a shocking disregard for their deepest moral traditions. And this profound disconnect really doomed any chance they had of a peaceful administration. Okay, so let's pivot here. If the military campaign was an absolute disaster, plagued by disease, blockades, and complete cultural alienation, why on earth did it actually change history? Well, it's because alongside his soldiers, Napoleon brought a small army of scholars. Which brings us to Section 3, the Scientific Institute, building the Institut d'Egypte. Setting up this scientific institute in Cairo was the true start of the expedition's intellectual legacy. Napoleon gathered some of France's absolute brightest minds to methodically catalog an entire civilization. They split up into these highly organized, specialized sections. You had mathematics teams out there calculating and mapping the land, including doing the early surveys of the Suez Isthmus. Physics scholars were studying the natural sciences and the local environment. The political economic section actually introduced the very first Arabic and French printing presses to the region for administration. And then, of course, literature and arts dove headfirst into the culture and ancient antiquities. But here's the funny thing. Before they could become the founding fathers of modern Egyptology, these brilliant scholars had to make sure the army actually survived. Since they were completely cut off by the British Navy, the greatest scientific minds of Europe were suddenly put to work designing bread ovens, figuring out ways to filter and purify Nile water to prevent sickness, comparing windmills to water mills, and even manufacturing local gunpowder. They literally kept the expedition alive through applied science. All right, Section 4, Unlocking Ancient Secrets. The journey south. Once those basic survival needs were finally met, their mission expanded into this awe-inspiring exploration of Egypt's monumental ancient ruins. By August of 1799, small committees of scientists and artists were traveling deep into Upper Egypt, often following directly behind the military. And by late 1799 and into 1800, they were relentlessly sketching, measuring, and extensively mapping incredible sites like Thebes, Karnak, and Edfu. I mean, these guys were sketching furiously, sometimes literally under enemy fire, to capture a level of grandeur that the Western world had entirely forgotten.
Which leads perfectly into Section 5, the Rosetta Stone, a miraculous discovery.
This is a pretty amazing little detective story about the most famous artifact from the entire campaign. In July 1799, while a lot of the scholars were still down south, Lieutenant Bouchard unearthed a heavy black granite slab from the mud during some routine fort excavations in Rosetta. They immediately realized they had found something extraordinary. The stone featured the exact same text written in 3 distinct scripts: Greek, Demotic, and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was rushed straight to the Institute in Cairo because they just knew, this could be the key to translating a completely dead language. But there was a major catch. The French were losing the war, and they knew they might not actually get to keep the physical stone. So scholars Marcel and Chante developed this ingenious chalcography process. Basically, they washed the stone with a light salt solution, carefully applied printing into the surface, and pressed paper against it to create exact, perfect replicas. It's a good thing they did too. They secured all that data right before they were defeated, and the physical stone fell into British hands. And speaking of falling into British hands, when the British forced the French surrender in 1801, General Hutchinson demanded all of the scientific notes as spoils of war. But the French scholars pushed back hard. Scholar Geoffrey St. Hilaire fiercely threatened the British general, declaring, "No, we will burn our own notes ourselves. You are seeking fame, but history will remember you for burning a second Library of Alexandria." It was an intense standoff, but the bluff totally worked. The British backed down. Now for our final section, Section 6, the lasting legacy, an empire of knowledge. Ultimately, while the empire of the sword failed completely, the empire of knowledge awoke modern Egypt and absolutely fascinated the world. Those scholars returned to Paris and spent the next 2 decades compiling all their findings into this, the Description de l'Egypte. It was a massive, unprecedented collaborative encyclopedia detailing the history, antiquities, and modern state of Egypt, packed with magnificent plates of ancient ruins, maps of the Suez, and exhaustive studies of modern society. It pretty much single-handedly birthed the modern field of Egyptology.
So that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Can the unintended pursuit of knowledge actually outlive the mightiest empires of the sword? Napoleon's political ambitions crumbled into dust, much like the ancient ruins his armies marched through. Yet the relentless curiosity of those scholars built a bridge across millennia that we are still using today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.